So hello everybody and welcome to our WMESA seminar for World Oceans Day in 2023. I'm Emily and today I will be hosting the session on behalf of the WMESA committee. So as WMESA is an international organization, we wish to acknowledge the Maori, Tangata Whenua and Te Reti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Indigenous peoples were the first Australians and New Zealanders and earth and environmental scientists, and we have a lot to learn from their deep knowledge that spans tens of thousands of years. The WMESA seminar series is about showcasing the amazing work of women in earth and environmental sciences in Australasia. All the recordings of past seminars are available on our website and YouTube channel if you'd like to take a look. You can sign up as a member for WMESA for free and get a notification of upcoming seminars, or you can follow us on Twitter. Okay, shameless plug over. So I'm delighted to hand the floor over to Associate Professor Helen Bostock from the University of Queensland and her sure to be fascinating seminar titled Reflecting on 20 Years of Voyages and Progress for Women in Oceanography. Take it away, Helen.
Thank you, Emily. So I'll just check that I am sharing my screen correctly. Can you see my slides or the slide?
We can see presenter view.
Presenter view, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully
Perfect.
now.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a bit of an interesting kind of thing to go through, to look back and think about how things have changed over the last 20 years. So I won't be covering a huge amount of my science. It's more going to be reflecting on how things have changed and what's the progress for women in oceanography. And I really want to celebrate the progress because there has been some really, really good progress. And so it's a bit of a reflection on my career and people who have shaped that career and shaped and the pioneers of the women pioneers who started in oceanography and sort of paved the way for those of us like myself to come along and made it a little bit easier for us to get our foot in the door as we've gone through our careers. And hopefully we're doing a bit more of that, and it'll make it easier and easier for future women to have careers in oceanography and marine geology. But first, like Emily, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we all meet, and there are people in New Zealand and also in Australia, so acknowledge all of those traditional owners. I also want to expand from just the country to also sea country, because when we're talking about the oceans, there is a lot of sea country out there that was traditional lands for Indigenous Australians before sea level rose. And I also want to point out that Indigenous Australians and also Polynesians were some of the first oceanographers. And so it's great to celebrate the fact that, you know, these countries that we sit on were, you know, really established by these early oceanography pioneers. So Indigenous Australians arrived in Australia between 65 and 60,000 years ago, probably through Western Australia, but also into northern Queensland. And here's some recent work that was done by Michael Bird and Sean Olm and others up at JCU, and looked into the potential ways that they would have arrived in Australia, and it would have involved them actually crossing open bodies of water. They may have been able to see where they were going from the tops of these sort of mountain ranges, and they would have been able to see where they were going. Unlike the Polynesians who followed later, they would have been setting off on very big open ocean journeys where they wouldn't have been able to see where they were going. And we know that they couldn't have got here by accident. There are strong currents through these, between these islands in Indonesia and stuff. And so they must have deliberately had to paddle to get to Australia. And we know that it must have been also women as well as men, because they had to establish a population when they arrived here. So although land was a lot closer then, because we were 80 meters below present day sea level, there still would have been these open bodies of water that they would have had to cross over. And we know that Indigenous Australians and Polynesians, Maori included, still have a very strong association with sea country and the sea, and their lives many of their lives evolve around the coasts, and they would have been using the coasts for transport, for resources. As they traveled around Australia, it was highly likely that they would have used the coastal routes to get around. And we know this from evidence, especially of things like fish traps that are present around the coast. And this is an example of one from North Stradbroke Island that sits just next to the University of Queensland's Marine Research Station on Minjurribah. So today is World Ocean Day, and the theme this year is around preserving 30% of the ocean to protect it for mainly biodiversity, but also for the health of the ocean. But I want to reflect back in 2019, the World Ocean Day theme was gender and the ocean. And I think it's still relevant to today. The theme was gender in the ocean and the ocean. The United Nations writes that the empowerment of women and girls is still needed in all aspects of ocean-related sectors, including marine scientific research. What barriers do modern women face in the ocean sciences, particularly those working in the field? And how can recent upgrades in technology, policy, cultural awareness counteract these issues? And so those are some of the themes I'm going to be covering today in this talk. But first, why should we care about the oceans? I know we all know this, but it's also a good reminder that, almost 3/4 of the planet is covered by water. We really have a blue planet. 97% of the water is in the ocean. Greater than 3 billion people, livelihoods depend on the ocean. And the oceans are play a huge role in climate. They really regulate the climate of the planet, but they're also doing a fantastic job for us of buffering the climate change that is ongoing. And so they've taken up as much as 93% of the excess heat that's come from climate change, anthropogenic climate change, and around 26 to 30% of anthropogenic CO2 has been absorbed by the oceans. So if it wasn't for the oceans, we'd be in a lot worse state than we are. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had a special report on oceans and cryosphere, and they summarized the changes in the ocean. This was in 2019. And so it's not just the uptake of heat and carbon, but also changes in oxygen. We know that sea levels are rising, and potentially there will be changes in ocean circulation that will have even bigger impacts on the climate going forward. As well as the IPCC report, finally in 2016, there was the first World Ocean Assessment Report. And this was very much done in a similar way to the IPCC reports. It was written by over 600 experts from around the world who compiled this report on the state of the world oceans. kind of surprising that it took so long to actually undertake such a review. But that first review found that, you know, the oceans aren't so big after all, and they are being impacted by human activity with widespread changes in physical, chemical, biological systems. And this was then, of course, followed up by a second report in 2021, which did a more detailed report on all the different habitats within the ocean and looked at a much wider and in more detail. But as a result of the first report, the UN declared the Decade of Ocean Science from 2021 to 2030. And the tagline being the science we need for the ocean we want. And unfortunately, because of COVID, this kind of didn't get as much coverage maybe as it should have, but they're still ongoing, and there are lots of initiatives around the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And the idea is to have much more integrated understanding of the oceans, but also new partnerships between research and business and communities, and understand more about the role of climate regulation, but also about the resources and opportunities that can be utilized from the ocean without declining, and using them sustainably without declining the health of the ocean. All right, so that's a little bit about the World Ocean Day and why we still have World Ocean Day, and what we're trying to, you know, raise awareness of the issues around the ocean. Now, a little bit of a reflection on my career. And I thought I'd start with maybe sort of reassure some of the students out there. I didn't set out to be an oceanographer. I set out in my childhood, I was obsessed with the outdoors. I was very lucky. I had a very privileged childhood where I did a lot of outdoor activities with my family, and we traveled a lot. And I grew up doing a lot of hiking, skiing, climbing, kayaking. And I wanted to be a mountaineer and an explorer. And so here is a photo of me in 1999 in my ski mountaineering gear. And I did manage to do one big exploration / expedition. In 1999, I set out with a group of 5 of us in the team, and we went to Greenland. And we basically found an area on the map that said unexplored and had nothing, was just blank. And we said, we're going to go there. And so we set out to explore an area called Louise Boyd Land on the eastern side of Greenland. Louise Boyd Land is named after an American photographer, female American photographer. And so with 4 guys, one of them of which was my brother, we set out to explore this area. And we planned to do some science. So we did some botany, some pollen analysis, and some geology. But we mainly wanted to go and just see what was there and climb lots of new mountains. So we climbed 15 new mountains that, as far as we're aware of, no one has climbed before. And we also climbed 2 mountains that other people had climbed, but put up some new routes. So it was a very successful expedition. For some reason, they nominated me as the leader of the expedition. I was the only female, and all of them were big guys. But it was a very egalitarian expedition. All decisions were made by everybody. And it was an amazing trip and incredibly successful. But what I learned from that trip is, A, I've missed the period of time of exploration by about a century, and B, raising money to go on these adventures is incredibly hard work. It took me 2 years to raise the money with the rest of the team. And it's very hard to make a career and living out of being expeditioner and explorer. So Plan B. Plan B was, you know, I had a degree in earth sciences. And so I decided, okay, well, let's try and do a PhD. So I moved from the UK to Australia to do a PhD at the ANU, the Australian National University. And my PhD was in oceanography and oceanography. And so since then, I have undertaken 12 voyages and open ocean voyages, and then a couple of coastal voyages as well. I'm interested in that climate-ocean interaction and how the oceans play a role in climate and buffering climate, but also in climate change over longer periods of time. And I use a range of different kind of approaches to studying the ocean to understand those impacts of climate, but also how the ocean impacts on climate. But also one of the things I really love about going on voyages is actually mapping the seafloor and exploring new areas that we haven't been to before, we have no information on, and being sort of getting my little bit of exploration in there that I didn't get to do on land, but now we're doing in the ocean. And more recently, I've sort of started working on more sort of marine pollution issues as well. So when I talk about research vessels, these are the 4 research vessels that I have been on during my career. They're all over 70 meters long. And I have been on voyages from the tropics down to Antarctica. And these are both international and national vessels. So the Investigator is the Australian research vessel, the Tangaroa is the New Zealand one, and the Joides Resolution is the IODP or vessel, and the Falkor is a philanthropic organization run by the Schmidt Ocean Institute, and an American vessel. So here's some stars on a map showing the locations of the voyages that I have been on over the last 20 years. But the first voyage I did was actually to the Caribbean, to an area called the Demerara Rise, just off Barbados. And that was back in 2003. And that was an ODP, an ocean drilling program voyage, leg 207 on the Joides Resolution. So I have been, you know, exploring mostly the Southwest Pacific and Southern Ocean during my career. So what got me into that? So I started my PhD, and the original title and was supposed to be the Paleoceanography of the Capricorn Channel, Southern Great Barrier Reef. And I thought, well, surely there's been lots done on this already, but back in the early 2000s, actually it turned out that there hadn't been very much done looking at deep sea sediment cores to understand the changes in the Southern Great Barrier Reef and how the reef had responded to glacial interglacial cycles and changes in the oceanography. And so there were other projects going on at JCU and other places around Australia that were looking at the Central Great Barrier Reef. And what I found was that what's happening in the Southern Great Barrier Reef is quite different to what had been found in the Central Great Barrier Reef. And that was primarily due to the fact that the topography and the bathymetry of the region is quite different, and the reefs don't act like a barrier in this area like they do up in the Central Great Barrier Reef. Here it's much more, the reefs are much more dispersed and spread apart. But I also realized during this first part of my project working on sediment cores and using these cool little microfossils, foraminifera. It was my first introduction to foraminifera, which I still use today, and my students still learn how to pick out these teeny tiny forams with their paintbrushes today. what I realized was I needed to understand the oceanography of the region a lot better. And it turned out there was very limited information and previous work that had been published on this particular region. Fortunately for me, at the time, the World Ocean Experiment had just finished. It was run in the 1990s. And the first sort of global data sets were put online, freely available for anyone to use. And so the small box here in the middle here is the sort of area that I originally started looking at, these two red lines that were relevant to the area that I was working on. But I got a bit carried away and expanded to the whole of the Pacific. This is one of those like PhD projects that just kind of expanded and got a little out of control. So I taught myself oceanography with the help of some oceanographic friends at ANU in the GFD group. And I plotted up my TS diagrams, but also oxygen and other geochemical traces that had been collected during the WOS voyages. And I focused in on this intermediate water depth, which is between 4 and 8 degrees water temperature. And I showed that the intermediate waters are not the same throughout the Pacific. And so I defined or redefined using the geochemical traces, which had never really been done before. Everybody had used, you know, your typical hydrographic traces of temperature and salinity and density. But by using the geochemical traces, I showed that there was actually a lot more going on in these intermediate water depths between about 500 meters and 1500 meters in the water column. And that actually we had a lot more mixing going on. And so there were very distinct, geochemically very distinct regions in the Pacific. So my little project that had started on the Southern Great Barrier Reef expanded to the Pacific. But during my time at doing my PhD, I realized I wasn't going to get the opportunity to go on a voyage in Australia because the RV Franklin had just been sort of decommissioned. And so I looked for other opportunities to get hands-on experience, and the ocean drilling program had an opportunity, so I applied. It wasn't relevant to my PhD. This was all about me just getting my hands-on experience. And I felt like I couldn't call myself a marine geologist or oceanographer if I didn't have that kind of experience. So it was really important to me. So I took the 2 months off my PhD, about 6 months or no, a year before I actually finished my PhD. And I headed to Barbados to join the Leg 207 voyage. And I kind of started looking at all these voyages to kind of get a sense of like how many women were there actually on there, to just get a sense of how we've been progressing. So this was my first voyage 20 years ago. And so 8 out of 29 of the scientists were women, 27%, and about 6 out of 21 of the technical staff were females. So it wasn't too bad. It wasn't like I was the only one, but certainly the women were mostly younger, mostly students and postdocs, and there were very few women, sort of senior women on the voyages. And partly that was because it's a 2-month voyage, which is a huge commitment for people to undertake. Most of these ocean drilling program are 2 months. But also back then, we had very limited email. It was purely almost like a text message. You weren't allowed to send any files or any photos. This voyage was the first time there was a satellite phone on board that anybody could use, but you know, it was incredibly expensive, and we had no internet. And also it was the first time that we had a defibrillator on board, and fortunately we did, because it had to be used later in the voyage. So this was me. I was one of the sedimentologists on board, so my job was to log the cores and to describe what was going on in these sediment cores. And I think I single-handedly described and logged 2,000 meters of sediment core. So steep learning curve, but I got pretty good at it by the end. And we were incredibly lucky. It was, we managed to capture the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, the extinction of the dinosaurs, complete with the sort of iridium spike and stuff in the cores, which was unexpected because it wasn't what they had set out to drill. They thought it was missing. So it was a massive experience for me, and I learned a huge amount by being on the ship. I also loved the fact that going from a PhD, which is such a solitary, or can be, was for me a very solitary experience, to suddenly work in this large team, and we had a lot of fun. And I realized after going on this voyage that this is what I wanted to do for my career. I wanted to work on research ships, and I wanted to be a sort of marine geologist, oceanographer going forward. So I got the bug. I guess you could say I got the addiction. It started 20 years ago. So a brief kind of potted history of women involved in the deep sea drilling program, ocean drilling program, and international ocean drilling program or discovery program. The program started in 1964, and the first woman managed to get on board in 1968. I think there was the first female co-chief in 1968. The first Australian woman was Dr. Elizabeth Truswell, who went on in 1972. And in the first phase of DSTP, there were only 1.5% of all co-chiefs were women. Then was followed the ODP, the Ocean Drilling Program, and that was when I participated in. 2003 was the end of the Ocean Drilling Program. Only 12.5% of all the Australians who participated in the project were women, and 8% of co-chiefs were women. Going forward into IODP, it increased to about 17% of co-chiefs were women. And in this final phase that is currently wrapping up and will finish next year, we have about 38% of co-chiefs have been women, or will be women, because we've still got some to go. So we're making progress, and I feel like it's been slow and steady, but we're making good progress in women's participation. And to think that women were actually banned from research ships for many, many years, both in the US and the UK and in Europe. Main reason was proposed that it was because there wasn't suitable facilities for women on the ships. Not quite sure what they thought women needed, given that, we haven't really changed the ships much, and we're still working on ships that are about 30 years old, and women are coping just fine. It was just a good excuse, I think. So Elizabeth Truswell, who was the first woman to go in 1972, she was actually at ANU when I was at ANU. She was an adjunct researcher then. And so she was one of the mentors who, encouraged me to go, but also explained what it would be like, and provided me with some tips. And in 2019, she actually wrote a book about her experience of going in 1972. It's a rather diplomatic book. It's not quite as juicy as I'd hoped to find out more about what it was really like. I also at this time met Professor Leanne Armand, who was also very encouraging for me to go on voyages, and also became a mentor over time. And Leanne unfortunately died in early 2022. But I just want to make a plug here for the fact that the Leanne Armand Travel Award is now open for PhD students and early career researchers who are interested in microfossils. So that's deadline is the 15th of September. So we set up this fund in honor of Leanne, and thanks to all the contributions from people towards this travel fund. And Leanne was a big mentor for many women oceanographers, and she will be sorely missed. So after my PhD, I actually did a couple of years working at Geoscience Australia, while I also worked at the ODP office at ANU. And I guess it's worth pointing out, I actually never imagined that I would be an academic. I wanted to go out and use my skills and research in very applied ways. And so I always sort of had my sights set on working in government or in research agencies to do that rather than going into academia. So after 2 years at Geoscience Australia working at the Coastal CRC, the opportunity came up to apply for a job at NIWA in Wellington, and it just ticked all the boxes for me at the time. It involved going out on big ships and doing a wide range of research. And I jumped at the opportunity to go to New Zealand and spent 12 fabulous years working at NIWA before returning to Australia in 2019. So the Coastal CRC, what I did there, I did a lot of sediment work on the Southern Great Barrier Reef. I just finished my PhD on the Southern Great Barrier Reef offshore, and now I got this opportunity to work on the onshore as part of a cool team, actually part of a very large team of the Coastal CRC that was CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, and a couple of the universities. Quite a different experience from doing my PhD, but I enjoyed it. I loved getting out and doing fieldwork and working as a team. I was on very short-term contracts, a few months at a time for about 2 years. And so, yeah, when the permanent job came up at NIWA, I decided that I wanted to apply for something a bit more ongoing and continuing. So I moved there in late 2006, and over the 12 years I was there, I got to participate in a number of different voyages. The ones highlighted in blue are the ones where females were the voyage leaders, and the ratios there are the number of females to males, the females being the first number. And you can see that actually, you know, NIWA was pretty good. We had a pretty balanced number of male to females on these voyages. And I don't think it was deliberate. I think it was just, you know, we were just the person that was needed for the job on these voyages, especially early on. So yeah, and it was great to see women scientists leading these voyages. I think there'd only been a handful of female chief scientists before I was a chief scientist in 2011. There was also great training at NIWA in the fact that early career scientists get to shadow more experienced scientists on voyages, and then they're kind of expected to then learn the role and then take on leadership on their third or fourth voyage or so. So it's a great opportunity to get that training because being a voyage leader, even just learning all the different things that you do on a ship, you actually have to get on the ship and learn how to do it. You can't really be trained to do that in a classroom or during in the office. So I got to also do a couple of different types of trips. I did a commercial voyage, but I also did a trip with the the New Zealand Navy up to Raoul Island and the Kermadec as part of a Sir Peter Blake expedition, which took 30 high school students with us on the Canterbury ship. So that was quite a different experience. And while we were out there, the Havre volcano erupted and we came across a big pumice raft, and it was all very, very exciting. I was also really lucky that when I was at NIWA, Mike Williams was a big mentor for me, and I did many of these voyages with Mike. I think, you know, half of these voyages were done with Mike, and he kind of showed me the ropes on how you go about planning a voyage, all the sort of going through all the process, and then being a co-chief with him on the Macquarie Ridge voyage in 2008 was a great experience. He showed me how to lead a voyage well, which is harder than you think. And so during those voyages, I learned a huge amount of skills, hands-on skills, how to operate multi-beam and process the data, sub-bottom profiling, like a shallow water seismic, lots of different types of coring. I really enjoyed the hands-on part of setting up the core and deploying the core with the crew, working closely with the crew, learning how to run a CTD and sample a CTD, and also plankton nets with our Mock Ness monster that we had on the ship. And I also learned about leadership, and I learned how to work really closely with the captain and the crew, and to develop really good relationships with them to ensure like the success of voyages. And it really does come down to developing those relationships and working with the entire team to make sure that your voyage is successful, because, you know, it's not just about the science. There's a whole range of factors that go into making decisions on a ship, including the weather, including what gear can be deployed under certain conditions, what the direction of the waves are, all those kind of things need to play a role in it. But also while I was at NIWA, I also learned quite a lot about working with Maori iwi, especially on Chatham Island, where I was lucky enough to get to go and do a project. And so there were lots of learnings across the board. And here's just a few of the sort of snapshots of some of the teams that I worked with. And you can see that, you know, we really did have quite a good representation of women on most of the voyages I was involved in. I can't say that across the board, but at least the ones that I found the voyage reports for, it was fairly even. And it was great that we managed to get quite a few students on board. So quite a few of these are students. Also at NIWA, I was lucky enough to be supported and mentored by Janet Bradford-Grieve. She's a copepod specialist, but Janet was the first female voyage leader in New Zealand back in 1967. And she led 10 voyages over 10 years from 1967 to 1977, and then a few more after that. And she was really a trailblazer for us at NIWA, very supportive of female researchers. She's sort of now retired, I think now, but she was someone I would go to just bounce ideas off and get a sense of how to go about dealing with situations. She also, you know, gave me tips and advice on how to lead voyages, which I'm forever grateful for because they were incredibly useful. Another person who also, you know, mentored me quite a bit on voyages was Di Tracy. I went on a voyage with her in 2008, and she always supported many of us, and recently was just awarded an award from the Women in Science for her mentoring of younger women. And Di Tracy really, you know, was one of the first females working in fisheries science, which is even more male dominated than oceanography and other types of marine science. And she, pushed for women to get on board ships more regularly. So after 12.5 years of really learning my trade at NIWA and working with some amazing people and having great colleagues, I really built up a great network, but it felt like it was time for a change. I call it my midlife crisis because I'd just turned 40 and felt like I needed a new challenge in my life. And for some reason, I got it in my head that I wanted to try teaching. So despite never having thought I would be an academic, a couple of my colleagues at Victoria University, where I had been a adjunct researcher for 9 years and had been co-supervising students, they encouraged me to apply for an academic job and helped me craft my CV and write my cover letters to start applying for academic type roles. And I was lucky enough to get one fairly quickly at the University of Queensland. And I reached out to lots of my Australian network that I developed when I was a PhD student, and everybody was very excited for me to come back. And it was great to come back and be invited to be on voyages and part of projects. And I felt like it was very lucky, but it also made me incredibly aware that networking is so important. I don't think I really appreciated it until in 2019 when I came back to Australia. And most of my network were my peers that I'd done my PhD with at ANU, or that I'd met at conferences during that time, or working at the ODP office. And so they were just people I had interacted with. And I remember being told, networks are really important. You need to network. And I thought, what is this networking thing? It's such a nebulous kind of concept. What does it mean? Well, it turns out whatever I did, I built quite a good network. So I'm very thankful to past Helen for being good at that. Unfortunately, I arrived just as COVID hit, or just a few months before COVID hit. And a lot of those initial voyages that I was invited on were postponed, but also other opportunities came up. And so one of those opportunities was the chance to get on the RV Falcor in early 2021. And so the Falcor was kind of stuck in Queensland because of COVID. And so they were reaching out to people around Queensland who had voyage experience and could lead voyages. And so with about 3 weeks notice, I was asked to help lead a voyage with Robin Beeman from JCU. And so we pulled together a team, which was mostly women. So 8 women, a lot of students, and 5 males, including like the technical team. And we left just on Boxing Day of 2020. And we were out at the start of the ocean decade for the decade for ocean sciences. So they wanted to be out, the Schmidt Ocean Institute wanted to be out pinging in the new year. They had no idea what pinging means, the alternate meaning of pinging anyway, but they meant the sonar ping that is mapping the sea floor. And so we were out there mapping at the very start of the new year, literally 1 minute after midnight. We were mapping the area. We'd been mapping for a few days up until that time. So they wanted to sort of contribute to, I want to make the point that all these voyages are very collaborative. And so this particular voyage had many collaborators. but specifically we were collaborating with the Seabed 2030 project to collect this new data for the seafloor. And the area that we targeted was the Coral Sea Marine Park, because there's very little information for Parks Australia up there. So this was, you know, a combination of, you know, needing to do this mapping for the Australian government, but also for research opportunities. And so over the space of a month, we mapped 40,000 square kilometers of this southern Coral Sea Marine Park, and we contributed all that data towards the Seabed 2030 initiative. So, and then I had a undergrad student, Megan, look at this data and think about what it might mean or what it tells us about ocean circulation at the bottom of the ocean, where we tend to think of there's hardly any flow, but actually the seabed forms that we saw down at 4,000 meters was suggesting otherwise, that there was quite a strong oceanographic flow going on. So we all think that we know a lot about the seafloor, but actually the seafloor was only mapped, or the first maps were first produced of the whole global ocean in 1977. I think the original maps in the North Atlantic were in the 1950s, but the first global map was produced by a real pioneer of females working in marine science, by Mary Thorpe. And she used this single beam approach to look at the seafloor across the North Atlantic. Now, she was never allowed to go to sea because back then the women were banned from going to sea, but she put together these maps. And when I was at NIWA, actually right outside my office was this 1977 map. And it was so inspiring to me that every time we went out, we would collect new data and we'd be contributing to understanding the seafloor better, and filling in this map that was developed from very minimal data. She did an amazing job considering the minimal data that she had at the time. And now we see maps like this, where it looks like the ocean is completely mapped. But the aim of Seabed 2030 is that we want to complete this map. And currently, going backwards, sorry. Currently, we actually have only covered about 25% of the seafloor, which is a significant increase from when we started compiling all this data in 2021. When I say we, the royal we, there's a big team behind Seabed 2030, and NIWA is leading the charge for the South Pacific. And so when at the start of the decade, there was 15% covered of the seafloor, we're now up to, in 2023, as of May 2023, we're up to 25% of the seafloor covered. So we're making good progress. But still, it's probably quite aspirational to get to 100% by 2030. There's a lot to do, but with new technology, maybe it's possible for all these unmanned vessels to go out and start collecting data in the more remote areas of the world that have had little data collected. Also, during this Falcor voyage, I was inspired by we had an artist on board who was making artwork out of plastic that she had collected on the beach. And so I was inspired to start looking to see if we could find plastic in this water way offshore from Australia. And so we started using what we could find on the ship to start looking at whether we could see any plastic in the water. And unfortunately, we found plastic in pretty much every sample. And we actually found more in the deep waters than we did in the surface waters. So a lot of it is actually sinking down to the seafloor. And so here's some microscope images of the plastic that we found. This one is from 4,000 meters, whereas this one has some plankton in. So this is a surface water sample. Last year, the rescheduled HALO voyage that was supposed to be in 2020, but get rescheduled because of COVID, went last year. And this was the fabulous team that went on that, led by Jodie Webster and Marty McNeil. And again, a really collaborative voyage with lots of institutions and international collaborators involved in that voyage. Had to go through a COVID quarantine. We had several people actually get COVID in quarantine, but thankfully during the voyage, we were lucky to avoid all quarantine. And this was a very cool voyage, relatively shallow voyage on the Northern Great Barrier Reef. And this early publication has just come out in EOS. So we were looking at bioherms. Bioherm just means a aggregation of biologically formed material made out of these Halimeda algae. And so these Halimeda, they look like this. They're green when they're alive, but they're actually aragonitic calcium carbonate skeleton. And when they die, they basically deposit their flakes on the seafloor, and they've formed these bioherms over time that just accumulate the flakes. And what was fascinating about this, and I'd love to hear anybody who's online, who's a marine person, who has done lots and lots of mapping of the seafloor, but I have never seen any kind of features like this before on the seafloor. So it looks a bit like Swiss cheese. We called it the green donuts because the Halimeda tend to live at the tops of these features, and in the middle is more sort of a hollow. But why they form these shapes is an unknown question, and one we're still thinking about, and hopefully we'll do some research on to answer that. And when we look at the sub-bottom profiles going through these Halimeda bioherms, you can see how they've built up over time. And Marty McNeil did some original research on some older cores that have been collected from these Halimeda, and found that the oldest dates are around sort of 9,000 years at the base, where it sits on like the antecedent seafloor from when sea level was lower. So we know these are a Holocene feature, a relatively recent feature, and they have grown up over time. But why they form these strange topographic features is still unknown. And so we used a wide range of different types of equipment, and it was great for the students on board to get this experience. This is what the Halimeda looks like when you core into the top. These bioherms, you see that it looks like porridge oats at the top, and then it slowly breaks down to more finer material below. But we were studying these Halimeda bioherms with a wide range of different equipment to study different aspects of the bioherms, including doing some experiments. And here's a couple of my students who I know are watching. One just handed in her honors, Kim just handed in her honors, looking at the nutrient cycling in these bioherm incubation experiments and over the bioherms. So some cool, exciting research. Finally, in January this year, we went to Antarctica, another rescheduled voyage due to COVID. And this one was mostly led by women. Going down to Antarctica. Leanne Armand was supposed to be one of our colleagues coming on the voyage. Unfortunately, that was not to be. We had to brave some pretty wild storms on the way down, and it tested a lot of people's sea legs to get down there. And so I guess one of the things about being an oceanographer is you've got to know how to find your sea legs, or be lucky that you don't get seasick. So it's a bit of an additional challenge sometimes for people compared to working on geosciences and environmental sciences on land. But we survived, and here's the women of the team. So I wanted to highlight the very large group of women that were involved in this voyage. We did have some male members of the team. Out of the science team, we had 16 females and 6 males. If we include everybody on the ship, we actually had 22 women and 28 males, so almost 50-50. But that's because the crew is mostly still made up of males. So we celebrated International Day of Women and Girls in Science while we were out at sea. And here's the sort of voyage leadership team led by the amazing Alex Post, who's at Geoscience Australia, but also with Karen Noble and Zana Chase from IMAS down in Hobart. And here's the UQ team that went on the voyage. And unfortunately, we didn't get to spend as much time as we'd hoped down in Antarctica due to a medical emergency. We had to turn around, but we did have time to, in the 5 days we were down there, we mapped an area next to the Wild Canyon called the Amman Drift, or at least we are proposing to name it the Amman Drift after Professor Leanne Armand. So one thing about going to sea is we often discover new features that are unnamed, and it's a great privilege to be able to name some of these features after prominent people in the field. And Leanne had named a previous feature in the Totten area of Antarctica after another mentor of hers in the past. So highlights from my time at sea, well, you know, there's always something new. You learn lots of new technological stuff. It's about teamwork. It's cool multidisciplinary research. It really has to be, because you've got this expensive ship and you want to use it to every possible minute and every way you can to do as much as possible. I've really enjoyed helping students and mentoring them through these experiences, teaching them stuff, but also seeing them go on to develop their careers. And I've also, you know, created many new friends. So what have I noticed over the last 20 years? Well, I have noticed that there's been a big change, and a really positive change. And I guess that's what I want to celebrate, is there's been a big change in what's acceptable behavior on ships. Part of that is a reflection of what's acceptable in society. It's very hard when you're trapped on a ship, and it's hard to know how to complain and change behavior, especially when you're in the minority and there may not be senior women at sea to kind of talk to. There's a big increase in the number of women going to sea, and there's a lot more women in leadership roles, and that is having a big change in the attitude and atmosphere on the ships. I also think that there's just a general more awareness of, you know, what women need. So for example, on the RV Investigator, they had, you know, sanitary bins in every one of the toilets that were for anyone to use. They even had sanitary pads in there just in case. And so, you know, that's a big change from 20 years ago, where it wasn't, you know, there wasn't even a sanitary bin in the women's changing room, in the women's bathrooms, let alone in public ones. And now, of course, we have much better internet and communications. And so as a mother, it's much easier to go away and still be able to communicate with your family and with your kids, your husband and your kids, to also, you know, it's a lot less isolating than it used to be. And if you're having some issues, there's also more support because you can reach out to people on shore as well as on the ship. And nowadays, there's also opportunities for women who may not be able to go to actually participate in the voyage virtually. And this happened a lot during COVID-19, especially on the JOIDES resolution, but also on the Falcor. Not everybody participated directly on the ship. And we were having regular conferences, virtual conferences with people to make decisions and, you know, have them be virtually part of the voyage, which not quite the same, but it definitely allows women these opportunities to get more involved in voyages. And I would say the safety culture has changed a lot. When I started, safety gear for my size was pretty hard to find, if not impossible. Given some of these suits that these survival suits came only in large, and I thought, geez, if I'm ever in trouble, I'm going to die here, because these survival suits do not fit even in the slightest. So one size does not fit all. And so after quite a few years of campaigning, they started getting some smaller survival suits on ships. Still some lowlights. I remember having to fight for my voyages, and they kept getting rescheduled and shifted. I still get challenged on my expertise on how to use equipment on board, or just not asked for advice when I can provide advice. You still get gendered, sexual comments. I've dealt with sexual harassment issues for people on board. So there are still changes we need. And you know, there are a lot of sailors who've been going to sea for 30 years. And, you know, their attitudes are hard to change and take time to change. So it may be that we need some retirements of the current, you know, older generation before things will really change. Because I haven't noticed the same issues with the younger sailors that perhaps you get with some of the older ones. And, you know, there's still clearly issues. It was raised in EOS recently that women still have issues at sea. We do have some data on what it's like globally at sea. There's the IOC UNESCO report that comes out every few years looking at the ocean science. And so currently globally, 37% of the workforce in science, in marine science, is women. And Australia didn't really have much information in this global report. So probably one of the things, and New Zealand had none, so one of the things we need to do is to actually start collecting some data on the participation. The Oceanography Society had a couple of volumes over the years. Maybe it's time for another one. They've been sort of 10 years apart. In 2014, the last one, they highlighted that there's still a leaky pipeline for women in oceanography. And the number of female co-chiefs globally is still around 25%, increased from virtually nothing, but it's still got a little way to go. I was one of the women who was highlighted in the 2014 one, and the general consensus from that was that, you know, women love their jobs, but still find it hard to continue when they have families, and work-life balance is an ongoing challenge. And that's probably true across the board for all female scientists, not just in oceanography. In 2023, a new report came out led by Sonia Legg in gender equity, more general in oceanography. And the nice thing was that they've shown that there's definitely improvements in the number of women going from PhDs into academic or research positions in government. And so there's a much better flow through to the early stages, especially in the US, after they've put in some mentoring and leadership programs over there. And so things are changing, but you know, with 40, 50, 60% PhD students, we're still seeing only about 15 to 25% of full professors are women. So there's maybe time needed to see that really transfer through, but there's still the leaky pipeline that needs to be addressed as well. Oceanographic awards, women were just not existent before 2000, and there's still a lot that needs to be done in that area. So I want to encourage everybody to nominate your colleagues for awards, especially your female colleagues, but we really need to, if we want women to be represented, we need to nominate them. Increasing numbers of co-chiefs, 32% of IODP expeditions in the last in 4 years, and 24% in German ships. How are we doing in Australia? So I want to thank M&F for providing this information. We're doing pretty well. So if we just look at the first 3 columns here, you know, in between 2019 and 2025, we've got between 33 and 60% of voyages led by female chief scientists. So that's looking really good. And it does, of course, vary from year to year, but, you know, women are being fairly successful at getting voyages. So lots to still do, lots of obstacles still to go, especially for other minorities, not just females. But definitely, I feel like we've got quite a lot to celebrate and things that are changing in this space. So improvements needed. We need more data on actually what's happening in different countries. Mentoring programs have been found to be incredibly effective. We need institutional change around hiring and promotions. We need to build support networks. We still need to address harassment, and we need to remove obstacles. And there's a recent YouTube video come out about respect at sea, which I highly recommend. And we need to also start engaging with our traditional owners. In New Zealand is way ahead on this, but Australia is starting to catch up. So it's great to see much more involvement of traditional owners in sea country. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge all the people, I know I've run over, I'm sorry, all the people who I've worked with at sea, especially the crew and captain and technical staff that have trained me on many different pieces of equipment and how ships work. All my mentors, some I've mentioned, some are not mentioned. My networks that I talked about, I'm very thankful for. To my husband, who does most of the parenting and keeps everything going while I'm away. Fortunately, my daughter doesn't know any better than having a science mum who's away a lot. And I also want to thank all my amazing students that I've supervised and mentored. And here's a picture from earlier today of the UQ Oceans team that we're celebrating Ocean Day. Thank you.
Ooh, awesome. Thank you so much, Helen. That was such a pleasure to hear you talk about your past career experiences, your past experiences at sea. I think all of us had an amazing time getting to live vicariously through you in all of those voyages that you got to